Hello, I'm Robert Priest at Art Design Cafe. Having some familiarity with Nazi-era history in Europe and America can sometimes come in handy, especially when looking at the history of an American Nazi agent. I've been centered on this history after a few decades focused on contemporary art and design, with degrees in art and design history, with focuses on critical media analysis, and practical media communications to journalistic processing studies, with an eye on legal aspects. I also made the switch to Nazi-era history in America starting 4 years ago. This was prompted by the unclear pre-World War II history of a colleague of Philip Johnson's. They were colleagues after the war, and this colleague had a very different kind of 1930s history. So over the following audios, I'm going to loosely and informally re-examine the history of Philip Johnson from about 1932 to 1945, or to maybe 1955 with an eye on Nazi. Book authors Scholze and Lamster brought it forward to a certain degree. But there is a lot more for us to learn, and there's a lot more documentation out there to review. Anyone that has dealt with Nazi history and declassified intelligence can see a number of leads quickly. Both Scholze and Lamster were constrained in the book genre of having to offer a full biography of Johnson, including his architectural work. So we see that Philip Johnson's Nazi history was constrained to a few chapters. I envision an entire book focused on Johnson's Nazi period, and focused on that. In other words, Nazi in the foreground with other matters placed in the background. I dove into Nazi-era history about 4 years ago to look more closely at my core subject, Emily Hall Tremaine, and her mysterious 1930s in California. Emily was in the Nazi-anti-Nazi battle there, with national press regarding this. Emily, along with her third husband, Burton Tremaine, they married in 1945, were among many in contact with Philip Johnson after World War II. You can hear an introduction to the situation focused on Emily Hall Tremaine in the 1930s, if you like, also on the Art Design Cafe channel. Back to Philip Johnson and his Nazi-era history, but starting 50 to 60 years later. In 1996, a 90th birthday party was thrown for Philip Johnson in New York, and this party included a who's who in architecture. For me, this is the start of the journey. The photography is iconic. Younger architects gathered around Johnson, paying tribute to the master. Of all of the photographs I've seen of Johnson with people, this one has occupied my brain for weeks as I've been thinking more about Johnson. I find it lovely on the surface if one didn't know his Nazi history. I also find the photograph disturbing when reviewing Johnson's Nazi history. I'm wondering, are we looking at aligned institutional power, its strengths, weaknesses, and backstories? It seems to raise questions about the post-World War II architecture world. Some photograph may have read Scholze's biography published in 1994, or the article on Johnson the previous year that utilized the old get out ahead of the press article approach. Johnson admitted that he was indeed gay and also a 1930s Nazi. I guess it sounded edgy at the time. If that was the media strategy, it didn't work out very well. But then how do you get people to get past Nazi, and why would you? Just search Philip Johnson Nazi deeply in Google. Check out the mentions in Google News and or a newspaper database. The volume of mentions is into the hundreds already and seems to have become part of his brand, definitely after 2005. Back to the birthday party. So as we consider possibilities, maybe those photographed didn't read Scholze's book, but just heard about it and the media coverage, or not, or thought, well, that was 50 to 60 years ago. Or maybe they thought they knew a different side of Philip Johnson. And perhaps A few exceptions were morally bankrupt, did what they needed to do to advance their careers with this dynamic, and held their noses. Or maybe they were completely not bothered and smiled for the camera. Click. To me, not being architecture-centered for decades, it's sort of like a photograph of a birthday party for German filmmaker Leni-Riefenstahl in her later years that I imagine. Riefenstahl was once allegedly a girlfriend of Hitler's, an allegation she always denied. And like Johnson, Leni also lived an unusually long life. These friends of Leni's undoubtedly would also give her a pass regarding events 50 to 60 years earlier. I put a photo up of Johnson with his younger friends at his 90th birthday party in this video, but you can search for it instead. This is to avoid any higher level, shall we say, interest or maybe excitement. Some people don't like their awkward history staring right at them, including architects, and maybe especially. Now, some folks today give Johnson a pass for his earlier Nazism while calling out other Nazis and the like. No contradiction there. Would it be unfair to refer to these folks as Nazi apologists? You decide. So for some in the architecture world, Johnson gets a pass. He apparently reformed himself, they tell us, and Leni's friends gave her a pass. She either reformed herself or her history has been misunderstood. I don't give Johnson a pass, but with all of the peer pressure, if one pet Nazi were designated to get a pass, I'd vote for Fritz Wiedemann. Do you all know who Fritz Wiedemann was? His nickname was Fritzy in a San Francisco newspaper. Here's a photo of him with a few others. You could see smiley Fritzy to the right. Fritz Wiedemann was previously Hitler's boss of sorts, and then he became Hitler's adjutant, and Hitler was Fritzy's boss. Here he is photographed with Hitler and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward and Wallis, in October 1937. This was after Edward gave up the throne and married American socialite Wallis Simpson. I think you know that the British royals, Edward and Wallis, via declassified intelligence, have been shown to have been rather pro-Nazi. Well, months later, in early 1939, Fritzy ended up becoming the German consul of San Francisco and head of espionage for the west coast of the U.S., down to South America, and also the Pacific. German consuls were expelled in the summer of 1941, and Fritzy was later based in China. In 1945, Fritzy was captured and first brought back to the U.S. Fritzy was back, and he spilled the beans. Did he ever spill the beans? Brilliantly, thoroughly, and somewhat theatrically, he served up a number of Nazis on a platter to his American interrogators. Fritzy said he'd been against the regime for some time, and I recall sabotaging their efforts a bit. He was later put on trial at Nuremberg, and I recall Fritzy, my pet Nazi, was also given a pass, just like Philip Johnson. But Herr Johnson never had a Nuremberg-style trial, so that's partly why we don't know a fuller amount of details of what he was doing during his Nazi years. And this burying the past led to generations of architecture students becoming completely uninformed about Herr Johnson. I never would have referred to Johnson in my architecture portfolio as a 17-year-old many years ago in the 1980s, nor can I imagine any of my friends would have referred to him either. But there might have been a Nazi apologist or two. There might also have been an opportunist. Did you know the terms diehard, opportunist, and the complicit were used in 1945? The U.S. Army was classifying Nazi agents and supporters sort of in this way. So the history of Philip Johnson's Nazi past is not only when that actually happened. The history of Philip Johnson continued as an issue as late as the 1980s and even continues to this day. What's different among Fritz Wiedemann, Leni-Riefenstahl, and Philip Johnson is that Johnson has designs on the landscape and are branded as such. So they are not just buildings, and they aren't monuments, but they are kind of like monuments to him. Consider this photo on the video again. We see Fritzi to the far right, then Hitler, and the Duke of Duchess of Windsor. Do you know what this has to do with Philip Johnson? This is where a deeper dive into Nazi history can tell us more about Philip Johnson, or at least context around him. And now I'll give a preview of not one, but 3 contexts for investigation. Sometimes you find things digging into people at nearby points. Do you know who brought Edward and Wallace to meet Hitler? His name was Charles Bedaux. He was one of the first industrial management consultants. His startup company became international quickly. Do you know where Charles Bedaux started his business? Cleveland. Yes, the city where Philip Johnson came from and was active to some extent, along with New London, Ohio, from later 1935 to maybe early 1938. And he was there popping in now and again. Do you know among the estimated 500 clients that Bedaux had in the United States, which ones were in Cleveland? Bedaux's clients included 2 companies that Philip Johnson's father had high-level interest in. One of these companies was called out for business with Nazi Germany. Do you know where Charles Bedaux tried to take Edward and Wallace after meeting Hitler? The United States. In fact, a tour across the United States was planned to meet many top-level businessmen. Charles Bedaux knew many of them. A scheduled stop included none other than, you guessed it, Cleveland. The tour, however, was canceled at the last minute due to union protests. The unions didn't like Bedaux's schemes to accelerate worker productivity. Did anti-Nazis, however, tip off the unions about this? Now let's turn to Wallace, described as rather Nazi by 1941. Do you know of a mutual friend of Wallace's and Philip Johnson's in London? He was noted in a biography about a female spy. His name was Channon. He was originally also from the U.S. Midwest, pro-Nazi and bisexual or gay. Chips was noted to have partied with high-level Nazi German officials at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Partying with high-level Nazis at the Olympics? That sounds like something Philip, at that time, would have really enjoyed, no? Next, do you know who Wallace's longtime friend, a socialite from Cleveland, was? Her name was Mrs. Lawrence Lanier-Winslow. Her husband, who died, I recall, in the late 1920s, worked in U.S. intelligence for U.S. embassies. She was known to entertain the theater and elite gay crowd in Cleveland in the 1930s. She often traveled to Europe, meeting Wallace Simpson and others. Was Philip pally with those in Mrs. Winslow's sphere too? But did Mrs. Winslow rat out on Wallace to the FBI? Did she rat out on Philip Johnson? A page each in FBI reports on Wallace Simpson and Philip Johnson suggest that possibility. So it's interesting that Philip, whose later accounts are a strong basis of his Nazi history, didn't mention Chips Channon, nor the names of his social contacts in Cleveland, as I understand it. So in recap, Philip, London, Cleveland, Cleveland, and Cleveland. Maybe it's all a coincidence. Deeper research will inform. If you think like I do, that Johnson was a bit of a narcissist, that in addition to trying to marshal thugs in Ohio into a group to advance his agenda and power, that he was interested in more than intellectualism and architecture, that if he could, he would have dived into the faction of the social set that was pro-Nazi, that he might try to leverage his father's business contacts to advance himself, that he not only would promote Nazism beyond so-called journalism, if he were asked, then you'll begin seeing the scope of the investigation in addition to deeper dives of what has already been tabled. Note that every person that Johnson interacted with that was a German government official, both in Germany and the United States, may indeed have mentioned him in their reports. And these reports may be sitting in archives in Berlin right now. Also out on British intelligence, certainly with the Chips Channon element for starters, and there's a bit more. Assistant Professor of Architecture at Princeton, V. Mitch McEwen, of the Johnson Study Group that protested against Harvard and the Museum of Modern Art, regarding Johnson refers to, quote, cover stories, end quote. McEwen wrote in a recent letter, there are also reasons to think Johnson's role in Germany has been underappreciated by historians who often repeat his cover stories. This may sound conspiratorial, perhaps, but in the small world of elite architecture and egos, including some number of its publicists, its curators, its academics, its book publishers, and trade press journalists, I agree with McEwen. Cover stories. There are curious, huge gaps in the research of the Nazi agent turned architect Philip Johnson when you focus on his Nazi history. I'd argue to take this further, it needs to step out of an architectural history framework. It must be pursued by independent persons not tied to the field that have examined other historical Nazi agents and supporters, and those with experience doing deep dives into records and declassified intelligence. The challenge is it interesting enough to historians of the Nazi era? While Johnson was big in architecture, it's not like he was Hitler, Leni Riefenstahl, or even Fritz Wiedemann. However, via Rachel Maddow's attention to Johnson, maybe now interest will grow, but I wouldn't count on it. In this regard, in these audios, I will walk through a kind of research brief, a draft, an outline for an investigation. Johnson's full Nazi history must become known. No more cover stories.